Well, this year, more than most, I suppose, the government's financial plan is inseparable from its desire to win another term in office. That's probably a statement of the obvious, so it'll take seats to hold and seats to win. Joining us for extended commentary today on Afternoon Briefing, two MPs whose job is to stay in the Parliament, keep their seats, that is. Labor's Anne Ali from the West and Liberal MP Jason Falinski from Sydney. Welcome back to both of you on what is a beautiful autumn evening. Sure beats May budgets, this late March business, and also I think a pretty special occasion for you, Anne. You wouldn't say so, but I am. Happy birthday.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping the budget delivers me some nice birthday presents for the people of Cowan.
Let's take your...
It's hard to believe she's only 30, right?
Well, 30 with 25 years experience.
What were you doing in the first 5? Anyway,
let's take Anne's
you can see why they chose the two of us for extended
Exactly.
commentary.
We couldn't be happier. Jason, why don't we take Anne's cue on that? What presents haven't been opened already? Have you been clued up by the government on what the complete package is so that you can take it to the people?
Yeah, we know that what this budget needs to be about is helping people in the short term with cost of living challenges that they're facing, especially for working families, but also for young Australians. We need to create a safe and secure environment for people who've worked hard all their lives so that they can, in retirement, know that they've got the money and the funds that they need to live their lives to the fullest in their retirement. And also we're going to have to look at things like home ownership as a major issue for young Australians. There will also be other things around climate change, about net zero, all those sorts of things will be announced and released in the budget.
Sure, but that hip pocket nerve stuff needs to be large enough to be noticed and appreciated, maybe even electorally appreciated, while not tipping fuel on a raging fire that is the Australian economy.
Was that a cue to talk about the fuel excise?
Well, yeah, go on. We'll get there. Plenty of time for us to talk about that. But just on that Economic Balancing Act, anyone can shell out money before an election. That's
Sure.
easy.
Yeah.
Not overheating the economy is the difficult part.
Yes.
You're going to acknowledge that there is a large degree of risk around this budget?
Oh, absolutely. We live in a very uncertain world at the moment. I don't need to tell you that because you're on top of the news more than Anne and I are. But, you've got invasions in Western Europe, the first war in 70 years. You've got inflation back at rates that it was in the late 70s, early 80s. And, we need to ensure that we've got a budget that is future-proofing Australia against those shocks that we've seen just in the last 12 months. And that's before we get to a recovery from a global pandemic that no one saw coming.
Yeah, not saying it's easy, but Anne, we've already heard from Jim Chalmers acknowledging that he's going to have to do a reset if you guys are successful in the election. It does raise the question, how critical can you be at this budget when we largely know most of it is going to be supported for political, even if not economic reasons?
Well, that's right. And Jim has made that point, though, that, this needs to be a budget that takes us beyond the election. It's not just a budget for the government to win an election, but a budget that is for the Australian people to see us out of a pandemic. And Jason, all of those principles that you mentioned that should be in a budget, I wholeheartely agree with you. These are the things that should be in a budget. The question is, will they?
If you agree with me.
Well, there's the kiss of death right now. Will they be in the budget? Will they be in the budget, and will this government be able to deliver on its promises to the budget?
Right.
In the budget.
Specifically, what measures?
Specifically those around home ownership for young people, I think Jason mentioned. And I think, on Q&A, when I was on Q&A, I think the week before last, there was a young girl there who was, saying, what has this government done for me? Now, she was, I think she was 19 years old, which means that this coalition government has been in government since she was 10 years old, and they've had 9 years to prepare for a generation of young Australians who will be looking to buy their own home, who will be looking to go to university and sustain themselves through education and looking for their first job. And they really haven't delivered for those young people.
But are the circumstances lining up for them now when we look at the forecast for unemployment? Not everyone is going to enjoy the jobs boom, which we're told is afoot, but but are their prospects better right now than they've been for a while?
I think, you know, when we talk about that jobs boom and the unemployment figure, I think that the figures only tell part of the story. There's another part of the story in the fact that some people have 2 or 3 jobs, and they need 2 or 3 jobs to simply get them through the rising costs of living because wages have stagnated. In fact, real wage growth has tanked, and that's something that the government has refused to address, and even in question time today, the Prime Minister was unable to answer that question about real wage growth.
Yeah, well, Jason, Labor's been hammering this wages issue for so long now. The tools aren't always direct tools that governments have on wage increases, but is there a tool at all in this budget to give that the lift?
Look, in the short term, when you find unemployment dropping below 4%, that creates an enormous amount of pressure in the jobs market and for wages. And the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe, and if Anne hadn't left my Committee of Economics to go and become an expert in national security issues,
already was.
She would I walked into that one.
You did.
But if Anne was still an economist, she would have heard Phil Lowe say on several occasions that the data is probably actually a false data, because what is happening is people are changing jobs at a record level. About 100,000 Australians have moved jobs in the last 3 months. Their increase in salary is not being captured by the data. It's only when you get a wage increase in the current job that you have that's getting captured. So what we should see in the next 6 months, as that starts to fill through the system, you will see real wage growth very high in the Australian economy. And so, but to make that sustainable, you need to get productivity underway as well.
Yep. All right. Well, we've got many more topics to get through between now and the end of our time this evening. It might be a cue, though, to talk to ACOS, because with unemployment scraping down into the 3% range, the expectation is that jobs should never be easier to find. Unfortunately, of course, that won't be true for many Australians who shouldn't be forgotten, even in economic boom times. At least that's where the Australian Council of Social Service comes in, and its CEO, Cass Goldie, spoke to us earlier. So, Cass, you've seen a few budgets come and go now. The ones that fall on an election eve, conventional wisdom would say that's not the time to hit welfare recipients or anyone in the sector you look after. Is that how you're feeling this year?
Well, I certainly hope the government sees that what the community wants is a government that's not getting out of the way, it's actually ready to do the things that are needed to protect people. We went into the pandemic with over 3 million people living below the poverty line and about 750,000 kids. That's pre the pandemic.
Yeah.
And over the last 2 years, we've seen some really big growth in inequality. Some people have done really well, actually. If you're in the housing market, probably doing okay. For other people, rents have gone through the roof, and of course the cost of living is the big debate of this budget.
So where do your reasonable expectations fall? We know, we're pretty sure, there's going to be a cash splash, $200, $250, maybe a bit more. Is that going to work for the lowest income earners?
Well, look, we want a budget that's really responsible. We want the dollars to go to people who really need them. We need to lift up the incomes of people who have the least so that everyone can at least cover the basics. Some people are struggling with the cost of living more than others, Greg. The second thing is build social housing. We're not supportive of this first homeowner scheme being extended. Those were the kinds of policies that actually fuelled upward pressure on the housing market. That's the last thing we need. We need to focus on low-income housing. Let's build that and increase Commonwealth rent assistance. That's the other key payment for people on low and modest incomes. People will get nothing out of tax cuts. It's about 30% of households don't get any help at all from a tax cut. They're the people we're worried the most about, and we think the government should focus there.
Okay, so housing is a pinch point. What about the jobs market? Much will be made that this economy is going gangbusters. One measure of that is unemployment with a 3 in front of it. Is that, from where you stand, a good thing? Is that going to see people who were on welfare now getting meaningful work?
Well, of course, We want to see real full employment. I mean, for people who are on job seeker, desperate to get paid work, we've got really a unique opportunity to help people who are at the back of the queue finally get to the front. People with a disability, people who are single parents, people who are older, over 45. They're people who've really struggled.
Are you feeling genuinely optimistic about that?
This is an opportunity, but we've got to get it right. So we need to make sure that we're tackling sort of the wages part of that picture, investing in care services, making sure aged care, childcare, they're all areas where there's good job opportunities, a jobs and training guarantee, focusing on people who are most at risk in the labour market. That's also really important. Let's not forget climate change, Greg. I want us to recognise that today, again, we've got people all over the country who are really distressed by what's happening with the floods. And for those people, they're losing jobs today, and there's a real fear that they'll never get back in.
Job seeker, obviously it's been an ongoing campaign for you and others. Is there an implicit acceptance by you now that there's nothing happening when it comes to permanent increases in that?
Can I say, Greg, what an extraordinary proposition. Here we are with a budget that's all about the cost of living, and what we want to talk about are people who have the least. Isn't that right for all of us? That's where all the journalists should be asking, what about people who are on job seeker, just $46 a day? That payment needs to be at least $70 per day to be close to covering the essentials, covering the basics, the cost of living, making sure that those dollars, if we're going to be able to reduce unemployment, and we should be celebrating every person that gets a job, they certainly do, this is a great time for us to be lifting the adequacy of that income support. We learned that lesson, didn't we, during the pandemic, right? 2020, the government finally lifted income supports to be more adequate. For the first time, people could sleep better, they could cover the essentials, and it was really great for the economy because those dollars got spent in the real economy, keeping other people in jobs.
So you think the example has been set?
We've demonstrated
you can
how important it is, both to us economically and also socially.
If there are no nasties, if there's no pain, no clawing back now in this year's budget, do you fear that that is just a deferral that some government or another in the future, under the name of budget repair, is going to go there again?
Well, anybody that understands the fiscal position of Australia, where we're at in terms of our revenue base, also our commitments on essential expenditures like aged care, like childcare, knows that we have to grow our revenue base. At the moment, the budget is already locked into effectively austerity. That's why we've seen the devastation of what's gone on in aged care. That's why we're seeing across the country people can't get their kids into childcare. There's a reason for that, because our public expenditures are not adequate to meet those essential needs in the Australian community. So we can't afford eye-watering tax cuts. Let's get rid of those stage 3. People on higher incomes don't need more dollars today, actually. We need a responsible budget that grows the revenue base so that we can invest in the big challenges, poverty, inequality and climate change.
You might be shouting at the clouds there on the tax cuts, though,
I don't think so.
they're baked in, aren't they?
I don't think
Labor's
so, Greg.
not going in?
Any government coming in after this election is going to be looking at the budget papers. They're going to be seeing where those dollars are going. Those $16 billion that's being spent in those stage 3 tax cuts, 2/3 of them go to higher income men. Let's talk about gender equality. If we were to adopt the policies ACOS is talking about, most of the benefits would be going to low income women and their children. Wouldn't that be a great outcome?
All right, well, that's a discussion that we'll have, if not tonight, then through the campaign, and if not then beyond the next election. Cass Goldie, thanks so much for joining us. Okay, so why don't we bring back in our panellists, Anne Ali and Jason Falinski. We want to cover off some thoughts on housing, but just picking up on a point prosecuted by ACOS there. There are two things we're not talking about at the moment as much as we have in recent budgets. One is permanent increases to job seeker allowance. The other is revisiting any of the already legislated corporate tax cuts and personal income tax cuts that are already locked into the system. Jason, to you first, are they two ideas that are done and dusted? It does not appear that either of these, well, certainly not the tax cuts, would be touched by your government this time around. definitely not job seeker either.
Well, JobSeeker just got a $9.5 billion increase in payments. So if you're on JobSeeker, and I know ACOS always is calling for more increases in JobSeeker, this government has produced the largest increase in JobSeeker since the 1980s. The second part...
Not all of those were permanent features, though. You're talking about some of the supplements that were put in place for the pandemic?
No, I'm talking about the $9.5 billion increase in the fortnightly payment. Yep. That's the single largest increase in JobSeeker since...
Can I just interrupt you there? I just wanted to ask you, how much does that equate to per fortnight?
I believe it equates
to... For the average job seeker?
Per fortnight, I understand it equates to an extra $28.50 a fortnight.
Unfinished business from your point of view, Anne? I mean, would Labor go back there itself?
Well, I think we'll wait and see what's in the budget around a whole range of other measures to ease the cost of living for average mums and dads and families. But obviously, I'm an advocate for an increase in JobSeeker, being one of the few people in Parliament who has lived on welfare after fleeing domestic violence and becoming a single mother. And I know how difficult it is. And I know the humiliation and the sting of having to put half your groceries back at the counter and what that feels like. I wasn't very long on JobSeeker and the single parent payment, but it's always something that stayed with me. And I know that when I'm out there talking to people in Cowan, that cohort of Australians who we are talking about, those who can't find a job or who can't find a job to their skill level, who are overskilled for a job and who are relying on JobSeeker, I know they're doing it particularly hard.
But if Labor in office were trying to move into a budget repair phase, trying to put the pandemic behind it, what sort of audience do you think you're going to get for that argument that you'd be making from the caucus?
I think there's always an audience who recognise and understand that, that there needs to be fundamental change. That JobSeeker, you cannot live on the amount of JobSeeker. I mean, you think about it.
So that'd be an immediate priority.
How much would you, like, what amount could you live on?
I can't give you an amount that you could live on because what I could live on 20 years ago as a single parent with 2 children changes. It's different. It's different now.
But if that
and
argument
I wouldn't want to put a figure to it. I would not want to put a figure to it. I think we need to
can't you give us a
do
ballpark?
No, I can't give you a ballpark because I wouldn't know now. I think we need to do a lot more modelling. I think there needs to be a lot more looking into it. And to be honest, I haven't looked into it.
No, fair enough. But what you're saying is the timetable and the prioritisation that a Labor government would put to JobSeeker would be very short term and very high priority, would it?
I don't know.
Should it?
I don't know. I think what we need to do, as Jim Chalmers has said over and over again, is wait and see what kind of budget we inherit. Everything, the budget reply speech, as Anthony Albanese, the Labor leader, has said, is not going to be an alternative budget. It is going to be a response to what we hear tonight.
Yeah.
So I think everything is really about what we inherit if we were to form government, what we inherit from this government in this budget. Right now, the coalition, of which Jason is a member, is in government. Right now, the coalition is responsible for delivering a budget. And right now, the coalition is responsible for any increases in minimum wage or JobSeeker.
But Anne, with respect, that argument is, frankly, not worthy.
Why?
Because you guys are running to be the alternative government. Now, it's all well and good to say, I want to give more money to more people. Well, how much? And why? I mean, I want to give more money to more people too.
So do you think you could live on JobSeeker, Jason?
Well, I can tell you now, like you, when I had my own business, I had to return half the groceries on more than one occasion.
Exactly. So you know what it's like to struggle.
I absolutely understand what that's like. And as I say, I want more, I wish I had more support from more people at that time. I understand what that feels like. But ultimately, there isn't unlimited resources.
No, you're
and we have
right.
to make choices.
No, you're right.
And you guys want to be the alternative government. So there needs to be, someone at some point has to say, look, it's not just a wish, here's the actual, this is what we're going to do.
But we don't know what we're going to be dealing with.
Yep.
We don't know what kind of budget will be handed down this evening and what, if we were to form government, what kind of budget we'll be inheriting. What we do know is that we're inheriting a huge deficit. There's no more back in black.
No.
Right?
Before we get into that, though.
So that's what we have to work with.
But you will know.
You're asking me to use a crystal ball to try and get... No, you are, because you're asking me to try and guess what it is that's going to be in the budget tonight, what we're going to inherit should we form government, and what the conditions are going to be like.
But surely
let me intervene there, Jason, because that's exactly why we have budgets, so that we flash out these starting positions. It looks like a Labor government starting position would be a coalition's ending position, and vice versa. Minus $70 or $80 billion, we're told, is the sort of ballpark for deficits that we're looking out for tonight. Plenty more to discuss with both of you. We might move to sort of international matters and regional matters next, but for government or opposition, now is a good time to be putting the Australian voting public first, for pretty straightforward reasons. But there are still roles that Australia is expected to play as a good regional and a good global citizen. So Roland Raja is the Lowy Institute's lead economist and head of International Economics Program. We caught up with him a little earlier. Roland Raja, thanks so much for joining us. This budget is obviously being framed with the election that lies beyond it very much in mind. Is that a bad time for those like yourself who keep an eye on much needed foreign aid? Do you have any apprehended fear that it could be targeted for cuts, given the domestic pressures on the budget right now?
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me. I mean, I think the reality is that, for better or for worse, foreign aid doesn't tend to feature very strongly in domestic Australian politics. That means, on the negative side, that there isn't generally a very strong constituency arguing for more aid, despite what the need might be internationally. I think obviously there can be some pressure when the budget is under heavy scrutiny, and there's a sense that we're doing it tough here in Australia. People can cast a more sceptical eye on the foreign aid budget. Nonetheless, it's also the case that, based on the polling data that we do have, based on that done by the Lowy Institute, but also the Australian National University, there is a reasonable amount of support also in the Australian public for both the current level of aid and possibly doing a bit more. But generally, I don't think it will feature too strongly within the politics.
So much has changed since 12 months ago, indeed as recently as last week, with these reports of a security pact being negotiated in the Solomons. Do you think that provides the setting for a government, I mean the coalition government right now, but any government, to be reassessing whether they're winning this race in the Pacific, whether in fact they need to double down?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recent news around security negotiations between the Solomon Islands and China will obviously be looming large, I think, in discussions around the aid budget. I think the reality is that the Pacific is already the top priority within the aid budget. It already receives the lion's share of aid. And in an era when the aid budget has seen successive cuts, both in terms of dollars, but also relative to our national income, the Pacific was at first protected and then prioritized for increased funding. So the Pacific already receives a lot of attention, and perhaps rightly so. Solomon Islands already receives a significant amount of aid. Australia is the top donor in the Solomon Islands as well. I think the reality also is that aid is only one part of the equation at the end of the day, in terms of the race for influence, but also in terms of our ability to address the underlying drivers of civil unrest and state fragility and those kinds of broader development issues. And in that sense, I think also the thing to keep in mind is that it's not always just about the total quantum of aid. It's also very much, in fact, more so about the effectiveness of that aid. What's the ability to promote, not only better governance, but more inclusive development, and be responsive to what Pacific Islanders and the Solomon Islanders might want.
Yeah, as you say, a long-term project, and there's, of course, defence spending and infrastructure that goes with all of that as well. Can I ask you finally, Roland, about the effect of the war in Ukraine? Australia has been generous so far in providing energy, humanitarian relief in that part of the world. Do you think that sets up some sort of trade-off between the attention we would pay to the Pacific normally and what is now required in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because at the end of the day, if there is a fixed amount of money for the aid program, then there are going to be these kinds of trade-offs. There's obviously a huge need in the Ukraine for humanitarian and refugee-related support, but there's also a growing need, I would say, for dealing with the food security implications as well, because Ukraine and Russia are also major food exporters. That's pushing up international food prices, and the World Food Program is under pressure. There's a lot of needs in that regard. We look elsewhere in the world, though. You've got the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic still raging around much of the world, very negative economic and social impacts. So there's need everywhere. That's why the central issue, in my view, for the coming budget on aid is whether or not the government follows through on the effective cuts that they currently have planned, or whether or not they do some sort of reversal.
All right, well, we'll take a look at that and run a ruler over it, perhaps even with you at a later time. Roland Rajah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, so if you join the dots on recent weeks, what becomes really clear is that the Morrison government has tried to stake out for itself national security as a centre plank of its election campaign. So, Jason Falinski, I think there's some expectation that that might be built upon tonight with new instalments of money, cyber security, a multi-billion-dollar package, we're told. Should we be viewing that through, and I'll get your phone, there's a very important message coming through. Jason,
sorry about that.
Speaking
of cyber security,
we've all been there. Goodness knows who's trying to call you in the middle of a broadcast. But how do we separate, electoral imperative and this national security platform that the coalition's building and really essential investments that should be made in any event?
Greg, that's a huge question. I think, when you look at the rest of this century, to our capacity to crystal ball, as Anne would say, clearly climate change is going to be a massive challenge for us. But an equally large challenge for us will be the clash of civilisations between liberal democracies and authoritarian states. And national security needs to be above politics. So the investment of which you speak in cybersecurity, given that you could disrupt Australia's economy and indeed food supplies, fuel supplies, payments, you could in a very short time decapacitate the Australian economy and the Australian people without ever having to fire a shot. So it's very important that we get this piece of the national security piece right.
Right, so on and on go the investments, and are they in any sense politically contentious as between the coalition and Labor?
I haven't heard a reference to the clash of civilisations since I've read Huntington about 12 years ago. Anyone would think cybersecurity is a new threat, when in fact I was attending roundtables on cybersecurity back in 2009. So quite
Have we
frankly,
kept up with the game, though?
No, we haven't. I've always argued, even before becoming a Member of Parliament, even in my previous role as a professor, I've argued that Australia is way behind the eight ball on cybersecurity, not just in technical terms, but in creating cybersecurity cultures within organisations. We have now a critical infrastructure bill that, of course, extends the sectors of critical infrastructure quite significantly, and there are cybersecurity requirements now on organisations and industries. So any investment in cybersecurity is welcome.
Yeah, it could be substantial.
Far too late.
Yep. Broader national security question, and to you first, as you look at recent developments in the Solomon Islands, what is all this attention, what is all this money buying us if China is making the incursions we're meant to be preventing?
Well, I agree with Roland there, your previous speaker that you just had on there, that aid is only part of influence. And I think what we have here is a situation where we've had a very myopic view of national security that has excluded two components, has excluded aid, but has also excluded the influence that we could have around climate change and emissions reduction within our region. Now, whenever you have a void and you have a country that is pursuing an aggressive expansionist agenda like China, it should come as no surprise that they are going to take advantage of that vulnerability which we have created by not exercising our influence in the way that we should have within our region.
So we should have seen this coming, Jason.
We knew it was coming. We knew it was coming.
Why didn't we stop it?
Well, because we don't want to get it into bidding wars, and sovereign countries are able to do this thing. But I mean, I've got to say that's just an incredibly silly argument. I mean, Australia has committed to net zero by 2050. We are, one of the best planned, have one of the best plans in terms of how to get there. And we're talking about a country like China that has really no plan to get to net zero by 2060, has been doing very little around adaptation, has been doing very little around in terms of their investments in the renewable sector, etc. Australia, on a per capita basis, is investing more in renewable energy than anyone else in the world. I mean, China's not even on the league table of that. So if the Solomon Islands is making these things because they feel like we're not doing enough on climate change, then sure, there may be other countries they want to go to, but China isn't in the same universe as Australia.
Yeah, and it might go beyond climate change too. But let's just hold that thought. We do want to wrap up shortly with both of you and Jason. Just though to cover off another core constituency, that is business, especially for the coalition, but to both sides. So to check its expectations, we spoke to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry's CEO, Andrew McKellar. Well, Andrew McKellar, a really big week for the nation and a big day for the Treasurer. What about from businesses' point of view? What is the single most important thing that you'll be looking for tonight?
Well, Greg, look, I think that the biggest single thing from a business standpoint in the budget is going to be what does it do to address the fundamental pressures that we have on the supply side. Shortages of labour, critical shortages of labour, the worst in nearly 50 years, and equally in terms of supply chain, the pressures there, boosting business investment, encouraging greater capacity and productivity in the economy. I think those are the things that we've got to really see from a business point of view.
And what happens if it misses its mark? I mean, how dire are these supply chain issues, labour issues? What are we as consumers going to know or feel if this doesn't address those problems right now?
Well, I think the risk there is that we will start to see more acute pressure in the labour market. What we really need to do is invest in things like skills and training, also encouraging people to come back into the labour force, encouraging participation, and equally restarting migration, making sure that that's getting back up. All of those three things together are very important. If we don't have those, then I think the risk is that the pressures on prices, inflation, the supply side constraints, that's the risk that we could see that getting worse.
Cash handouts appear to be on the cards, for a whole bunch of reasons. Many would say legitimate reasons to ease cost of living. Are they risky?
Look, I think here business is not going to begrudge, I think some small steps in terms of cost of living. We know that there are a lot of pressure points there at the moment. We're seeing that inflation is picking up and cost for business much the same. So look, I think if there are targeted and temporary measures that are proportionate, then I don't think business is going to begrudge that.
All right, and into that category also, I imagine, would fall fuel excise cuts. Good policy or just something that you're going to have to roll with on a temporary basis?
Look, I think to be realistic, it's something we're going to have to roll with. It's not a long-term reform, it's a temporary measure, and it will have to be reversed at some point. So we can imagine 6 months down the track, we're going to have the reverse argument that suddenly, again, that extra cost is going to be coming back into prices. So look, it's temporary. I think we understand there are pressures there and there'll be a desire to do something in the short term, but I think more importantly we're going to be looking for those measures that really promote the long-term reforms in this budget.
And if everything works and business feels like it's pumping along back on its feet, that still leaves for the public purse questions around debt and deficit. Should we be bothered that no one's really addressing those right now?
Look, it's going to be a long-term track to get the budget really back into, a broad balance. We obviously
maybe 10 years.
Well, maybe 10 years. But I think we've got to see the first steps taken in this budget. We've got to see that there is a pathway to start to stabilise debt in the first instance and then reduce it as a share of GDP. So I think the time where we've had all of this stimulus, particularly on the demand side, that we've come to an end to that. Yep. We have to build capacity on the supply side. That's how we're going to promote growth and productivity and real wage increases, and I think that's where the strategy's got to start to move.
Sure, and just finally, can we say, looking back at the pandemic and ahead to tonight, that the worst is behind the nation, or more particularly the worst of the pandemic is now behind business?
I certainly hope so. I think we've learnt a lot in the last couple of years, and government has really taken some unprecedented steps in terms of fiscal strategy to buttress the economy during that period. But we now have to start to rebuild, build that capacity and resilience to prepare for the next emergency. We don't know where that will be, but we know that sometime in the next decade or so there's likely to be another situation where government will need to respond, and we've got to get back to a situation where we have the capacity to respond if we need to.
Yep, all eyes will be on tonight, at least in the short term. Anyway, Andrew McKellar, thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Great, thanks Greg.
Okay, so the trigger is pulled on this budget in just over 2.5 hours from now. That is when Josh Frydenberg takes to his feet and delivers the speech. Jason and Anne, you'll both be there. In fact, I think, Anne, this is your first time back in Canberra due to the whole pandemic Western Australian border thing in...
It's been a while.
A long while.
Can I tell you, it was much quieter without Anne here.
You missed me.
I did miss you. No, I did miss you.
Not quite as much fun. Okay, so that leads us to everything that lies beyond tonight. We are talking days, at most a week or so, until the trigger is pulled by Scott Morrison himself. Jason,
this is like Christmas for political
I'm not
journalists.
asking you, if you know, tell us by all means, but the 14th of May would be looking pretty good, right?
Oh, it'll be somewhere between 7th and 21st of May.
And the mood on the ground, particularly after South Australian election, I think that was a body blow to some of your colleagues. Even if they saw it coming, it's still a body blow.
Yeah, it was. It was a good government in South Australia. And
so what's different about the offering from Canberra?
I think the issues at a federal and state level are quite different, and that'll play out during the campaign. Also, a federal campaign is a lot more complex than a state campaign, because you've got to have messages that resonate in Anne's electorate and in my electorate, and they're as far away from each other as you can possibly get.
Right, and the West, is that going to be a happy hunting ground for the ALP? We were already thinking you were at or near a high water mark, but potential gains?
Oh, well, I don't take anything for granted, but, obviously we'd like to gain some seats in WA. I think, in terms of the feeling in Western Australia, West Australians still remember that Scott Morrison sided against WA and sided with Clive Palmer in trying to, bankrupt WA, basically. So,
they're
not
also the
very
Treasurer
fond.
who gave you that generous GST
well,
deal
that was something that the state government, the McGowan Labor government, also had a hand in. So, can't take full credit for that on his own.
We wouldn't give Scott Morrison any credit, would we?
Not on his own.
So
not on his own. There's shared credit there.
Yeah, is this for Labor and it's time? This is 9 years of coalition government.
I think
is
that's
that the
certainly
dominant feature?
Yeah, I think that's certainly what I'm hearing from people that I've been speaking to. There is a real disappointment. I mean, if you look at, for example, in 2019, the coalition promised a training hub in Wanneroo, which is now in Pearce, but was in my electorate. It never came to fruition. And one of the worst things that you can do is make promises that you don't keep, because the Australian public remember.
All right, all about delivery, says Anne. And just briefly, Jason, as we wrap up, we'll thank both of you in a moment, but is the economy, right?
Cost of living, home ownership, national security, getting to net zero, by or before 2050. They're the big four issues. That's what Australians want to talk about.
Well, both of you, Jason Falinski and Anne Ali, you're going to be free of Canberra to go and do what's required of you by your particular parties. You get to have a budget and a birthday in the meantime, Anne Ali. Go and enjoy
What a present.
What
a present. That's
all
right.
And joining Afternoon Briefing. It doesn't get any better than that.
Living my best life.
That is it for our special pre-budget edition of Afternoon Briefing this afternoon. So much more coverage coming up. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow for coverage of the wash-up. See you then.